All right, we'll get it going and let anybody who comes in late catch up as best they can here. Good morning. For anybody who doesn't already know me, my name is Darren Morgan. I'm the nursery manager here at Chenard's Nursery in Corvallis, Oregon. And we wanted to talk today about dry vegetable gardening. It's kind of an offshoot of dry farming, but focused a little bit on a smaller scale on the home backyard vegetable garden. I mentioned specifically where I'm from because we do get some international traffic on our classes, and it is incredibly relevant when we talk about dry gardening, where you are gardening from, because the situations, the types of crops, and the ability to do this will vary tremendously depending on climate, soil type, precipitation patterns, and such. So this is about dry vegetable gardening in Western Oregon. Take from it what you can from that if you're not from our area, and see how it fits into your situations. So dry gardening is kind of a old thing come back around again, kind of a recycled technique or technology. A lot of settlers that came west effectively dry gardened and dry farmed because they didn't have modern mechanized irrigation to water crops. So they had to figure out the rainfall patterns and what crops could grow and how to time the planting of those crops so they could be grown without supplemental irrigation. Most of the talks and information you'll see about dry gardening is really focused on dry farming, how to make this commercial, and just not my focus. There's lots of good workshops on that if you want to follow up on that on your small, your market garden or whatnot. We're going to talk about applying this in the small personal scale. So dry gardening is simply the ability to grow useful or edible crops with no supplemental irrigation. It can be included, but it doesn't usually include talking about short season, like overwinter crops, or short season crops that are done during the rainy spring season and don't actually move into the dry season at all. That has its place in dry gardening and unirrigated gardening as well, but that's really not going to be the focus of this talk. Understand that dry gardening is not suitable for every situation, even in our climate, and it's certainly not suitable for every crop. There are things that work, there are things that don't. We'll try to help you work your way through what you can and can't do with your situation. But for the container gardener, or the small raised bed gardener, this is not going to work because the principles of dry gardening involve getting plants to root out into a native water retentive soil and deep enough to avoid the worst of the drought effects. And that's just not something that can be done on a small container or small raised bed situation. So the limits to dry gardening, and understand that, yes, I've read a lot about dry farming. I've been doing dry gardening at home for several years. This is still very much a nascent work, a work in process. And I do expect that we will find more things we can do and more things to tweak the success rate on this as we go along. So bear that in mind. If there's something omitted, it may be simply an omission of inexperience rather than an omission of, oh, you can't do it. And this is a great area to do some experimenting in and seeing what works for you personally. So there are a limited number of crops that are significantly likely to be successful in an unirrigated garden situation in Western Oregon. The nightshades, tomatoes and peppers, are fairly easy to do in a dry garden. Potatoes, a little more challenging, but doable. When we start getting into other crops, it starts getting rapidly more limited. Squashes and melons, but generally speaking, not cucumbers because they just require too much moisture to keep going. Root crops are few and far between in a truly dry garden, but carrots are successful. And it didn't make the list on the slide, but last year I did sweet potatoes in my dry garden with at least reasonable success. So it can be done. Not very many legumes or leaf crops are suitable for this. Short cycle leaf crops that get done before the heat and dry stress certainly can be done. I've done short turnover bush beans the same way. If they're out of the garden by the 4th of July, they'll probably make it. But if you're trying to get them through a second harvest or a late planting and trying to harvest in August or September, the odds go way down that you're going to be very successful with bush beans. And pole beans simply are not suited for dry gardening in our area. But this is definitely, like I say, a list in process. Kale is an interesting point. I wasn't going to do that in my dry gardens originally, and then I read a few studies about dry farming them in Northern California, which isn't that much deeper, though actually parts of Northern California have more consistent summer moisture than we do. So I threw it in, and it's been a success in the varieties I've tried, and that's not a comprehensive endorsement, but we'll talk about that a little further down the slides. The main limitation to dry gardening really is, first, within the crops that you want to grow in a dry garden, there are some site and climate limitations. Really, you have to have a relatively modest dry period. We have a pretty good one here, but it's not all that long. It's real common for us to have substantial rainfall through April and even into early May. Rains often start up again in September, and we have that interim period that may or may not see any measurable rainfall, but frequently has at least an occasional spurt. Areas that have really long dry seasons with very short rainy seasons are usually not suited for this type of dry gardening, though many of them have some crops that can be grown that are different from what we do in the traditional Northwest vegetable garden. Generally speaking, if you're going to be dry gardening in the Willamette Valley, you're going to be doing it into native soils, not into raised beds or artificially constructed soils like hugelkultures. There's advantages to raised beds, there's advantages to hugelkultures, but dry gardening is not amongst them. You need these plants to work their way down to find deep underlying water that's trapped in the native soils. And so humusy or clay-y soils are great for dry gardening. One of the few advantages to working here in Corvallis in a very heavy clay soil base is it does simplify some of my dry gardening issues because there's water. For example, I'm on a wetland soil out northeast Corvallis for my home garden, and there's quite a bit of water down there at 18 to 24 inches under the soil level. If plants can root down into those hidden moisture reservoirs, they'll do just fine. Really sandy soils or rocky soils are a significant problem for dry gardening. Steep hillsides can be as well because the water tends to move off rather than soaking down in and creating perked water tables. So bear that in mind when you're looking at your sites, that not every site is suitable even if you're in native soils. Dry gardening is really not suited to very small scale gardening in terms of area space because, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the future slides here, but you have to give plants 2 to 3 times their normal footprint profile because the roots have to go down and they have to also go out and they have to be kind of free of competition for the available water resource. So it means you have large empty spaces dotted with plants rather than lots of plants with a few empty spaces. So to grow any sizable amount of produce in a dry garden requires larger commitment of time. A little 10 foot by 10 foot area can be dry gardened, but you're not going to grow a lot of crops in there. That area needs to be relatively free from encroaching competition of runnering shrubs like willows, major tree roots. If you've got a lot of trees within that 20 to 30 feet of your garden area, they are going to be taking most of that available groundwater from those lower reservoirs and starving or dehydrating your plants out. Even grass. The edges of my dry garden are turf. Lawn turf, and it's unirrigated, so it's not cheating. I don't irrigate that turf, but the grass does encroach into that, so I can't plant right up to the garden line on the dry garden, to the lawn line on the dry garden like I can on the irrigated part of the garden. One other factor that doesn't get talked about enough when people talk about dry farming and dry gardening is fallowing. You're not going to dry garden the same patch of soil year after year after year. You will collapse your soil. You should have 1 to 2 years between dry gardening experiences. That doesn't mean you have to completely fallow them. You can go to a well-amended, well-irrigated garden for your off year, but repeat dry gardening is kind of hard on soil biology and soil structure, and so avoid it. And we'll see this as we get into some of the slides. Basically, I split my vegetable garden in either thirds or halves. I've done a third of the garden dry and 2/3 irrigated. Currently, I'm running about half and half irrigated and half unirrigated. And so you cannot take 200 square feet, put it in dry garden, and just keep gardening it. You need to be able to rotate that space over the years, or you'll have some soil structural problems. So we're going to go through some of the individual crops and some of the ins and outs of doing them. And then after we get through some of the individual crops, we'll talk about putting this all together and how you make a dry garden work here. So tomatoes. Tomatoes are simple and highly successful on average. It is certainly well worth spending a little time on cross-researching with people who are dry farming tomatoes, so they're typically using commercial determinate varieties rather than sequentially produced indeterminate varieties, or playing around with different varieties year over year until you find what works, because there's quite a bit of variation in tomato performance in a dry garden, and particularly varieties that are already relatively prone to blossom end blight, which is a calcium deficiency symptom, are going to be much more inclined to have serious problems. And this includes like Romas, for a classic example. All the Romas and Roma types are pretty prone to blossom end blight pretty heavily. And in the irrigated garden, that's really never been a problem for me because I lime them heavily at planting, and I lime them heavily again about 4th of July, about midway into the growing season. Well, we did this in the dry garden as well last year. I moved almost my entire tomato production over into the dry garden this last year. And I barely had enough tomatoes to do any canning or processing with because we had such a bad problem with blossom end blight. And it's a combination of factors here that affect calcium availability. Obviously, the presence of calcium, there's none native to speak of in our soil, so it comes from your mulches or it comes from supplemental calcium like eggshell or lime. The problem with supplementing with calcium like lime or eggshell is that if it's sopping wet all the time, lime kind of dissipates, but if it gets substantially dry between waterings, that calcium sometimes granulates up and doesn't redissolve readily so that the plants can absorb it through their roots. So really dry, hot situations tend to exacerbate these blossom and plant calcium deficiency problems. Last year was a particularly vicious year, as I'm sure any of you in the area remember, 108 degrees, 110 degrees in June of all things. And that really set my tomato production back heavily. So we did recover out of it. We got tomatoes to eat, a very small amount of tomatoes for processing, but nowhere near the amount we'd planned on for canning. And so I'm going to hybrid that for this coming year, where I'm going to have some tomatoes in my dry garden, sure, but I'm also going to put some key high production canning varieties in the irrigated garden to make sure I have some volume. So over the course of 3 years, I would say tomato yield has been smaller, but almost as good on average, excluding a weird situation last year, in the dry garden as in the irrigated garden. But there is quite a bit of more fluctuation in tomatoes than with some of the other crops. And distinctly, that problem with blossom end blight is very noticeable after a hot season. There's no ready way around that organically. Obviously, keep liming on and try to find varieties that are less prone, and there are lots of varieties that are less prone. Synthetically, if you're not focused on specifically organic gardening in your dry garden, there are foliar calcium sprays you can apply to the leaves. I don't personally consider that watering, so because there's not that much moisture going on. So take it with a grain of salt, but there is that backup plan for you. Squash. So squash were the most stunningly successful crops grown with no irrigation, particularly zucchini squashes, but you can also do winter squashes this way. The yield was very, very, very slightly lower. And again, the calcium deficiency, blossom and rot problems are more pronounced. But I ran two plantings of zucchini last year. Both were groups of basically 3 plants. One in the dry garden, one in the irrigated garden. And it was even on a hot summer like last year, it was very hard to tell any difference in yield between the 2 plantings. They were very, very similar in overall productivity. So a glaring success, just stunning in how well zucchini did in the unirrigated garden. You can do zucchini from transplants. I do my zucchini and other squashes just like I do my melons, and in the irrigated garden, my cucumbers by direct sowing, and that is certainly still practical in the dry garden. So that's certainly an option. Peppers, bell peppers. I don't plant a lot with hot peppers. You can do hot peppers theoretically in the dry garden as well. Not a big part of my gardening. Key thing for bell peppers is to make sure that you have enough foliar cover on the fruit, that they're not sun scalding. And that was sometimes a problem in some of my dry gardens where I'm not getting quite as large a leaves, quite as many large leaves through the canopy of the plant. And so while you want light penetration down for ripening of the fruit, having lots of intense sunlight right on the shoulders of the peppers creates burn areas that then get infected. So it is possible, if you're seeing that develop, you could correct that with maybe a small amount of shade screen over the plant to give them some additional protection. Was not a huge issue. It was definitely still a successful yield. Walls of the fruit were smaller or thinner, and the individual fruits were smaller, but the yields were successful, particularly with very early ripening varieties like Gypsy. I have reservations about trying a variety that is intended for August, September harvest in a dry garden. I noticed my Gypsies, yes, produced nicely in early August, but they were starting to suffer fairly substantially towards the end of that month, even though there was no fruit on it. I just didn't rogue them out. Again, some increase in the blossom and rot, not anywhere near as much as we see on the tomatoes or the squashes, though. So kale, I've done kale in irrigated and unirrigated side in similar locations, similar years. I am primarily an eater of the dinosaur kale, the lacinato, the big coarse-leafed kale. It's just one of the easier kales for me to grow, and my daughter enjoys it just as much as I do, which is always a bonus when you're trying to raise teenagers. So dinosaur kale is incredibly successful in a dry garden situation. Yield is slightly smaller, leaves are slightly coarser, noticeable in if you're fresh eating them. Wasn't too noticeable cooked into dishes. Definitely good enough to repeat. A follow-up on that is what happened last year. So third year of significant dry gardening for myself. I had dinosaur kale in, and as I mentioned, 108 to 110 degrees, several days in June, right at the beginning of the major growing season. I had dinosaur kale in the dry garden, and I went out at the end, so I was obviously still working, and of course we cut off work early, so it was the hottest part of the day. I'd go home and I'd go look at my garden, and my dinosaur kale was doing something interesting. My lacinato kale was the centermost leaf was up like normal, but it had flipped. It had turned and twisted and curved itself over the top. And that was really consistent for the few days of that real hot spell. And about a week later, week and a half later, as we were cooling down, I went out and looked again, and those leaves had corrected. And from where they were twisted over, where the underside was exposed on the top, that tip of the leaf burned. And the whole rest of the plant was fine. It self-shaded its growing tip to keep growing, which was kind of an interesting adaptation, was not something I expected to see. So can't guarantee the frillier kales would be as tough, but dinosaur kale for sure is tough enough, and one of the few leaf crops that has much of a chance in an unirrigated garden for a summer. Carrots. So carrots are going to be a little variable from year to year, I bet. I've had success the last 3 years with small yields of carrots. The variability I noted in the slide here, yield was decent, size of individual carrots variable. I thought maybe I wasn't thinning hard enough. 3 years now of doing that in the dry garden, it's not just about the thinning. The individual carrots are substantially more variable in an unirrigated site than they are in an irrigated site. Bear that in mind. It's not unmanageable. The flavor is really good. The sugar content quite high. There's also going to be situations where you may not have a long enough series of rain or moisture events for good, even seed germination on carrots. Carrots are always a bit of a challenge from a germination standpoint. They take 20, 21, 22 days just to germinate. We don't normally get too excited about starting seeding carrots until right about now. If your site is suitable for it, you can maybe get out there and start seeding carrots in early April. Maybe the very, very end of March is doable. If I have seen years, but not dry gardened a year, where we suddenly dry out about the middle of April and we stay dry for like a month and a half straight, and then start getting a few light showers in late May, early June. I would bet you would have a pretty high carrot failure rate in germination if you saw that particular weather pattern develop that year. So be judicious. Don't bet your whole carrot crop maybe on the dry garden, but you can dry garden carrots. One of the few root crops that is suitable for dry gardening. A lot of our other root crops are actually brassicas, and they have challenges in super dry conditions regardless. Overall, carrots, I would say, are a success. I have done them 3 years running in dry garden with at least reasonable success every year. So potatoes. Advantage to potatoes is that you can actually plant them early enough to get good growth during the rainy season, and it's actually good for the potato to be dry during their final tuber ripening stages. So keeping that in mind, putting in 120-day potatoes in March for the dry garden is probably not your best bet. Putting in 60, 70, or maybe 80-day potatoes in March, you'll be at harvest as we're drying down and not trying to get those potatoes through that really, really hot, dry season. There was definitely a noticeable decrease in productivity. So I was getting about half the yield per square foot on potatoes in the dry garden as I was about potatoes in the irrigated garden. One of the challenges you would get into with potatoes in dry gardening period is dry gardening is highly successful in a really clay soil area. That's not necessarily the best way to grow potatoes, period. It does tend to lead to smaller tubers and smaller yields anyway. So sites that are really, really suitable for dry gardening may not be ideal potato growing sites in the first place. Overall success. Again, I've done that 3 years running. I don't put all of my potatoes in the dry garden. I put my longer storage varieties typically in an irrigated site. But the shorter maturation potatoes have been very successful and a good use of space in the dry garden. Bush beans was kind of a surprise. I'd heard a lot about not doing legumes in the dry garden because of the challenges, but I kind of did the math out based on, living my whole life in Western Oregon and gardening in my particular plot for the last 25 years. I kind of mathed out and said, 54, 55, 56-day bush beans from seed should mature before we're dry enough to lose them. So this was 2020 in the picture here. It was a good year for working with it. We had some rainfall sporadically through the spring and into even early summer, not tons. We got a great harvest off of those in June, from end of June from a mid-May planting. It was a good year. I was able to get out until earlier than average. We had that, like I said, as I mentioned, that rainfall. Got that good flush late June into early July and harvested it out. I didn't cull them out. Sometimes I do bush beans generally that way just to free up space for later plantings, but I knew there was no way I was going to fall and winter garden the dry garden because there's no moisture to get plants started. So I just left them in, and I actually got a reflush, an August-September reflush with a small harvest off of it. The flowers were not profuse, but there was some beans off of them. All in all, better than expected for bush beans. I have done that again. I did that again last year, and with similar results, a decent first production, a minor crop in the follow-up. And I'm continuing to do that and continuing to play with that. I would not work with really long production cycle beans, except maybe as a single crop rather than leaving them in for a reflush. And as I mentioned, pole beans, just the growth pattern is not suitable for a dry gardening. Caveat to that is that I planted my bush beans closer than I really should have, given that I'm dry gardening them. And that's my experiment for this next year, is to go ahead and actually space out. I did my bush bean row with plenty of isolation from other plants, but I didn't isolate the individual plants. And I think if I give them a little more square footage, they'll actually perform a little better. We also mentioned, and you can see in the picture here, melons. I have done both watermelons and the muskmelon cantaloupe honeydew alliance in dry garden. I never bet my entire melon crop on dry garden. I always do some in both sides. Has been quite successful. Melons are small, flavor is good, yield has been quite good all in all, especially on the cantaloupe muskmelons. The watermelons have been small enough. I would not say they were a great yielder, but they were successful. Cantaloupe were very good. Honeydews were very good in an unirrigated situation. That's definitely surprising to me. I always thought them to be much more temperamental plants. They have actually been doing often better for me in the dry garden than in the heavily irrigated garden. I mentioned also sweet potatoes, which I don't have a slide of yet. Last year was my first year doing sweet potatoes in the dry garden with a good solid planting in as early as I felt safe doing that, which is the end of May. I got a modest yield. I got about 2.5 pounds of sweet potatoes out of that planting, single plant planting, which is pretty light by sweet potato standards. My other 3 plants put together produced about 40 pounds in the irrigated garden. So yes, it did work. Yes, it's worth playing with, seeing if we can tweak it to get more successful. I am going to repeat the experiment. I wouldn't bet a whole lot on it. It is kind of hard to get the tuber size with no irrigation. So that's kind of an overview of crops for our area for dry gardening. I would encourage you to play around with your own favorites and experiment a little bit. I'm doing every year, I try a few new things and tweak what I'm doing a little bit just to see what's happening. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how this all works. And there's some definite do's and don'ts to dry garden here. And the first really critical thing is to start as early as at all possible to take advantage of the natural rainfall patterns we have. Now, obviously, with crops that are temperature sensitive, which include the vast majority of what we're talking about here, all your nightshades, all your melons, all your squashes in particular, that really means trying to get in the ground no later than maybe the very end of May or very latest first week of June. On my wetland soil out in northeast Corvallis, that is sometimes somewhat challenging. My soil is so heavy and so wet, I sometimes have trouble getting it tilled and worked appropriately in time to get those plantings in sequence. But it is critical that you take advantage of what moisture we have to get things going. You do need to prep the area ahead. This is not a style of gardening that is very compatible with no-till practices. You really do have to work up the soil. If you're doing in a larger scale, say a meadow or field where you wanted to do individual plants with large space between, you could probably just work the area where you're planting, but it would need to be a big individual patch for each planting. And you not working it at all, not turning the soil at all, is not an option in dry gardening. If you have weed mass or if you have any kind of organic mass like a cover crop on, you still need to follow the regular planting cover crop rules. You want to cut your weeds or cover crops, let them lay on the surface for a few days to a week, then incorporate them into the soil, till them in, and then you need to wait, depending on the material, maybe a week to 2 weeks or a little bit longer for really coarse material, between the time you incorporate that organic material and the time you actually get into planting. This is much more important for planting from seeds than it is from transplants, but it's still relevant for everything. The breakdown of that biological mass as it's incorporated in the soil, particularly the early stages, can give off gases that inhibit seed germination. It's also nitrogen negative during the initial decomposition cycle, so it can often be really hard to get things to start for 2 to 3 weeks after you actually till in your cover crop or weeds. We spend a lot of time here at the nursery telling people don't dig deep holes because all you really need is the surface root area of the plants to get established. That's not the case in a dry garden situation. You want bigger holes, both in diameter and bigger holes in terms of depth. You want to really be working that soil. So if you're normally planting your tomatoes at you're working something like 8 to 12 inches, ideally you want to be working more like 15, 16 inches down or more. Do a nice big deep hole and maybe 20 or 30 inches across. Get lots of organic material incorporated into that native soil. Lots of compost, mix it in. Spacing is critical. We'll look at some pictures here in a moment, but you need to allow your plants roughly twice, or in some cases a little bit more, but roughly twice the normal footprint. So normally with tomatoes, we say, well, you can plant them maybe 3 to 4 feet apart. Tomatoes should be planted in a dry garden at least 6 feet apart and at least 5 or 6 feet from other similar scale plants. Obviously, some of the smaller stuff can be a little closer. They need that lack of competition to thrive. And if you have plants too close together or too many secondary plants growing around them, they won't thrive because they're not picking up enough water. So this is a good example of, this is actually same year split garden. You can see on the left, the dry garden. You see all that large open space. I should have weeded before I took the picture, shouldn't I? Lots of this wide open space that is got a plant with a large open dirt space. That is appropriate spacing for dry gardening. And the picture on the right is my more typical, significantly irrigated garden. All the crops that I can't dry garden in particular, things like cucumbers and corn and such, and pole beans and such. So, and you see the density I normally garden for the irrigated garden. So this is almost 3 times as wide in my dry garden typically. I mentioned the timing has to be done right. So you have to either start your own transplants and get used to that production cycle. You remember that everything is slightly different. Basically, peppers take about 10 weeks from seed to ready to transplant, but tomatoes take about 8. You do often have the option, especially because you're talking about a home garden scale rather than a commercial farm scale, of simply going to the store, the nursery, and buying transplants when you're ready to plant. There's nothing wrong with that, but you do have to get that timing done correctly. I'm very lackadaisical and laissez-faire about timing your crops because we have such a really good growing season for most crops. Like, oh, if you get your tomatoes in, second week of June, you'll be fine. Not so much in the dry garden. Push as early as you can. Last frost date, Western Oregon, May 15th for the Willamette Valley. Putting anything out much earlier than that is chancy. I would recommend, if you're really excited about dry gardening, invest in or manufacture some covers so that you can maybe push that to early May instead of mid-May if your soil is amenable to working that early. If you can get them in a bit earlier and get them well established, you will be much ahead of the game, especially in these longer cycle crops. Direct sowing is just fine for crops that are suitable for direct sowing. I do all my beans, squash, and melons from direct sowing, including obviously carrots too, including in the dry garden. On the bigger seeded stuff like the beans and the squashes and the melons, it is certainly possible to pre-soak them. I put that note in this slide because I was doing that for a couple of years in my dry garden. I did not do that this last year in my dry garden, and I was still very successful. So you can certainly direct sow. There's no problem with that. I tend to direct sow melons and squash based on 30 years of experience of they really do better versus buying transplants and transplanting them. They really don't like being handled so much. So once you have done your holes and your soil amending and your planting, whether that's direct sowing or transplanting, you've got to mud in the plants. This is the only time you will add water to your dry garden. And that's simply you water the planting hole, and then you plant the plant as normal planting instructions. And then you really significantly water the newly planted area. And then you take your 2 hands, spread them out, and you press down firmly but gently to actually slightly compress that upper soil level that's all saturated full of water. So you do it before that water all drains down. You immediately water, you immediately press down. And what that does is that forces that water to kind of push through the soil, and it creates these little channels through the soil that the roots will follow down and follow the moisture down and find that deeper moisture profile. And that is one of the trick keys to dry gardening here is to do that mud in and do that press down so the roots follow down to where they can find the moisture they need later in the season. Make sure you're doing a thorough job of fertilizing at planting. This means long-term, slow-release granular fertilizers. Organics are preferred. That's what I use at home. I do get concerned about using synthetic fertilizers in a dry garden situation. First of all, because they're salts, they're going to make any stresses from dehydration worse. Secondly, because unless they're formulated just right, they don't have the right type of release patterns. They tend to release really rapidly and then taper off fairly rapidly rather than being a slow buildup and slow taper off. Organic granular fertilizers are excellent for dry gardening. Significant amounts of them, as much as you think that plant will need for the season, worked in. Now, we already know that plants like peppers and tomatoes that are in that 75-day or so range are probably going to still be running out of nutrition before they're actually at peak of ripening and productivity. Is you can make your fertilizer as thorough as possible, but you can't change the biology and the fact that it does break down and goes away and gets used. You will still want to do a follow-up feeding somewhere in the midpoint in the season for long cycle crops. Anything that's not done by early July, you'll want to be feeding again. Just be aware that this second fertilization, because there's no available moisture to speak of, is much, much less effective than it is in the irrigated garden. So count more on doing a very thorough job of your initial feeding. Still do your supplemental feeding, but be aware you're not getting as much out of it. The tricks to your follow-up fertilization, so tricks to your initial fertilization, work fertilizer in that soil prior to planting rather than just top dressing. In fact, I usually do both at planting. I'll do a measure into the soil, and I'll do a top dress measure right before I mulch. Your follow-up feeding in the season, you want to gently incorporate that fertilizer down into the mulch and soil layer, so that it's getting what moisture is available in the soil and what biological activity is available in that soil. Otherwise, it won't work at all. You've got to have the biology on the organics. That being said, I've mentioned mulch a couple of times. Mulching is a critical component of dry garden. You can use synthetic or fabric mulches. It's not the best, and I've gone away from doing that in my dry garden the last couple of years. The best type of mulch, first of all, would be an organic mulch at planting, but follow up mulch through the growing season. And to do that, you want to scarify or rake up the soil outside of the immediate planting area. So if you're looking, tomato has a planting area, you're covering maybe 15 or 16 inches across, but your next plant is 5 feet away. Rake up some of that surface soil, break it up around the outer edges of that planting area, and just kind of gently rake that crummy soil that you've broken up on over the planting area to create what they call a crumb soil mulch, native soil mulch, or they sometimes call that dust mulching. And what you're doing is you're creating a transition area. So you've got kind of dampish soil deep, getting progressively less damp as you get near the surface. And then you're creating this intersection of this crumb soil or dust layer, and it can include some organic mass as well, like compost as well, where your air exposure and your sun exposure is on the particulate crumb, and it's not really down there in that moisture soil. So it's creating kind of a barrier where you don't lose as much through evaporation. And that will help conserve what moisture is available in the soil so you don't lose as much of it. It's really important that you keep your dry garden exceptionally well weeded earlier in the season, just like a regular vegetable garden. What you'll find is in an unirrigated garden, by the time you're getting into early and mid-July, weeds are declining rapidly. They're not sufficiently competing in these dry areas either. So do keep it weeded, but it becomes easier and easier to weed as the summer progresses rather than harder and harder to weed as the summer progresses, which is what typically happens in an irrigated garden. So I want to encourage you to experiment with this and take my experiences and lessons with this and kind of develop your own rationales and your own experiences. I do want to encourage you to say, this is not a law that you have to do this way. You've got room to play and experiment. Nobody says your whole garden has to be one way or the other. You can see my garden there split, dry garden to the foreground and irrigated garden to the background. It's, 500 or 600 square feet of garden, only about a third of that's in dry garden. And that's a great way to, cutting a third of the garden into dry, cut my water bill approximately in half. So it can substantially make improvements in your water usage, even if you're not going all the way. I'm not an absolutist and an extremist. I like to play and kind of adapt to multiple situations. So it doesn't have to be all way one or the other. You can certainly explore and experiment without committing your entire vegetable garden to dry gardening all at once and then risking failure. So this picture is July 17th, 2020, very typical of a garden progression for me. Do play around, experiment, see what's out there, and try some other crops. That 2020, this is August, both of these pictures, August 1st of 2020. I did some, just for kicks, transplanted basil and cilantro, coriander in the dry garden. I always do a few of those in the irrigated garden. Basil was a resounding collapse. They really do like a lot more moisture than that. I got a minimal cilantro harvest off of my leafy parts of my cilantro, but if you let cilantro flower, then set seed, the seed, of course, becomes coriander. And the coriander harvest was actually quite good on that for the size of plant. Nowhere near the yield of a really well-irrigated plant, but not a bad experiment all in all. Some late summer pictures in the unirrigated garden. Melons ripening on the vine. Yes, they are smaller than they would be in an irrigated patch, but they were profuse and they were quite flavorful. Your middle left picture gives you some kind of broader perspective on that, and also kind of shows you where the cutoff is. You can see the pole beans in the background there, and you see some cucumbers on the kind of lower right quadrant beginning to spread into the dry garden. Those cucumbers are getting irrigated where they're planted. By contrast, you can see the tomatoes. They're smaller than tomatoes are in the irrigated garden, and the pepper between the tomato plant there and the pole beans is actually beginning to show quite a bit of foliage browning, but we've already harvested some peppers off of that. The bush beans are nearly at the end. We've got the last little bit of harvest out of them, but the kale is thriving in unirrigated. You can see one on the far left and one on the far right. So doesn't get any worse typically than that. Middle of August is about the worst point for your dry garden. And you can see in that bottom right picture, tomatoes on the vine, ready to harvest in August 20 in an unirrigated situation. So caveats to all of this. Yes, this is split gardening. I am irrigating, though I don't irrigate very heavily, not too far away. Is there a possible, we've got some laminar flow of water moving laterally through the soil into the garden, and thus providing some irrigation? Certainly, especially on the edges. There's likely to be at least a little bit of flow through. The lawn, which if you're looking at these pictures, is these two pictures at left and at bottom right, is square behind us, is unirrigated. There's no water. There's a big ash tree about 40 feet away, 30 to 40 feet away from that. I do have some ash roots into this garden, but not tons. If you look though at the far side of that bottom right picture, so that's my fence line. It's an interstitial area where nobody really has anything on the other side of that fence. There's some wild blackberry growing. Nobody irrigates on either side of that fence. That's completely as far diametrically away as possible from any source of irrigation. That is at least 40 feet from the wet garden there. And you see the plants are still thriving and unirrigated. So I think this is still a fair example of dry gardening in the home garden, even though I'm irrigating somewhat nearby. All right, that's what I had for you for chat from me. I would like to just open up, and if you have any questions, you can either put them in chat or you can unmute and ask them. I'd be happy to take them. Okay, so a question in the chat. Would a raised bed on top of native soil work? Yes, at least theoretically. If you have access for those plants to get on down into that native soil, and if the raised bed is not too tiny. What happens in a raised bed that concerns me is the amount of moisture loss laterally through the walls and evaporative losses and cracks where the soil interfaces with whatever the structure the raised bed is made out of. Really small raised beds have almost no available soil outside of those interfaces. You get bigger, you get 4 or 5 or 6 feet across and at least 6 or 8 feet long, probably just fine. In addition, if you're doing a raised bed where your soil that was added in is primarily loamy or native soils with some amendments rather than all really, really loose, light bag, potting soil, grade soils or whatever, that improves your odds. Raised beds do warm up earlier. Raised beds are easier to till earlier, but you do have to deal with the fact that they lose water faster. Question in the chat. I've experienced substantial cabbage moth issues with brassicas and crevallis, especially kale. See that I'm not using a crop cover, which has helped me, but not entirely solved my pest issue. And thoughts on that? Okay, lots of thoughts on cabbage cabbage moth control. There's actually a couple of them that we get here. Crop covers are incredibly useful. They do deter a lot of these. So does feeding birds near your garden. I find that the sparrows in particular, and to some extent the juncos, really do a very good job of keeping a lot of the bugs off my crops at the expense of some damage to the crops from them eating leaves. But tolerable to my mind. Much rather have a bird peck holes and chew holes in my kale than caterpillars in my kale. It's not a perfect scenario. So that's one comment on that. The other comment on that is early plantings. So whether that's early plantings of broccoli that harvest off as early as possible in the summer, or like my kale, I started back in late April in the dry garden, late April, early May in the dry garden. If you can get them bigger, you'll have less issues. What you also don't see there is the kale I threw out because it was so buggy, and that is another issue, culling. So there is no perfect situations. I do say that crop covers, whether you use the light spun covers are just great for insect covers. They're still suitable for use in an unirrigated garden. And if that's an ongoing problem for you, that's something to address. The other end of that is there's no organic gardening substitute for spending time in the garden and actually seeing what's happening in the garden and treating it effectively the moment it crops its head. So aphid problems in brassicas in particular, and sometimes in the tomatoes and peppers, and cabbage worm in the various brassicas. You see a few of them. There are great organic insecticides like neem or like spinosad. They're absolutely viable organic solutions to these particular problems. And you treat them immediately when you see them. And when you have a plant that is chronically suffering, you take that plant out before it infects the rest of the crop. Question in the chat came late for me. Is there taste of veggies different between irrigated garden and dry garden? Generally speaking, richer and or sweeter. The flavors are distinctly more concentrated in a dry garden versus an irrigated garden. So it is a noticeable difference. I definitely appreciate the flavor difference. They are but much more intense. There's also some textural differences. I mentioned in the case of the kale, the dinosaur kale, that it was distinctly thicker in leaf texture, and it was noticeable at harvest and for fresh eating, but not so much cooked. Same thing with tomatoes. They developed a bit thicker skin than they would normally otherwise. No difference I could tell in the squashes. Melons were slightly sweeter, and definitely smaller, but definitely slightly sweeter. How does tilling facilitate dry gardening? What is its role? It seems counterintuitive, but wondering if it's because untilled soil doesn't give the roots a downward route to future water. Yeah. So the biggest thing about tilling is to actually affect your soil structure in the routes downward. That's correct. Also, to really substantially control any secondary weed issues. You can't really not till. Now, in theory, you could just work a planting area, clear all the weeds around the non-planted area, and not till. You would have to work deeper. And at the point when you're talking about putting a shovel into 15 to 16 to 17 inches or so in an area 30 inches in diameter, and then chopping compost into that, I fail to see the benefit to not tilling, just tilling the whole area and working it. But yeah, you've got to enable the roots to go down, as well as limiting competition. I see some thanks in the chat. Anybody else have any more questions for me before I wrap this up? Anyone does want to review it or miss part of it, it will take us a few days of processing, but we will have this posted on our YouTube channel probably around mid to latter part of the week. So feel free to look it up if you missed part of it, or if you want to just simply review it. And appreciate the attendance. Thank you all so much.